Mists of Pandaria had so many problems with it, it's hard to know where to start. It's pretty much unanimous throughout the community that it was a weak expansion. If you don't believe me, believe the numbers. Blizzard has lost so many subscribers, and what's kind of ironic about it is the fact that they lost those subscribers from the Asian markets. That's right, with this expansion, they have literally screwed up 8 ways to China. That may just be the first joke I've done this whole series. There's a reason for that. Vanilla and the Burning Crusade were so far into the past at this point that I felt like I had to be more informative about them, and I very much liked Wrath and Cataclysm, so I didn't have as much to poke fun of with those. But Mists of Pandaria, they've given me a lot more to work with when it comes to making another mockumentary. Of course, I'd rather that they give me a fun expansion to enjoy than a bad expansion to mock, but I guess they weren't just up to it this time around. You know, all the way back in the Burning Crusade, I figured that at some point they would do an Alliance versus Horde expansion. This was that expansion in a lot of ways, but after the first quest chain in the Jade Forest, the Horde versus Alliance flavor essentially disappeared, at least until patch 5.1 and when the navies arrived. Besides that, Blizzard didn't do enough to market it as a Horde versus Alliance expansion. It was just, there's a new continent, full of kung fu pandas. Last expansion you saved the world from an insane dragon. This time you get to save a brewery from trash-talking monkeys and giant bunnies that barf carrots onto you. Isn't this just awesome, players? Now don't get me wrong, there were plenty of epic threats to deal with in PvE. The Shah were a credible threat that the Jade Forest quest chain did a great job of establishing, and they stayed a strong threat throughout the lion's share of the expansion. But did a single Shah appear in the trailer? No. It was just a kung fu panda, besting a human and an orc, scaring them to the point where they stopped fighting each other so they could team up to fight the panda, and that's pretty much the opposite of how the actual expansion played out. Then again, maybe it's a good thing that the marketing didn't do more to tell players, hey, the Alliance and the Horde are duking it out across a new, unspoiled continent that won't stay unspoiled for long. Check it out. Because if they had marketed it that way, more players would have been attracted to Mists, and they would have been disappointed by the actual progression they had to go through. To sum up how bad it was...
I probably sucked more today than anyone in the history of Kung Fu, in the history of China, in the history of sucking.
Probably.
Okay. Jokes aside, let's get into the details of the progression and why it sucked. Now, it's worth stating that at the end of Cataclysm, looking for raid was a completely new feature to the game. It allowed casual players like me, who had a guild that fell apart thanks to guild killing drama, to see content that had been inaccessible to me until looking for raid was invented. That's all well and good, but where does looking for raid fit into the progression of it all? If you're in a guild that's trying to progress, will you skip looking for raid or will you dive right in? I couldn't figure out the answer to that in Cataclysm. In Mists, well, that's actually a kind of an ambiguous answer too. And the right answer tended to be different at different times and different for different people for different reasons, making the whole progression a jumbled mess. Now, in my days as a hardcore raider in Cataclysm, my goal was to have the best gear I could possibly have before I even set foot into Blackwing Descent. If I'd been in a raiding guild at the start of Mists, I'd have had the same goal in mind. Get the best gear I can possibly get before I set foot into Mogushan Vaults so that my guild has as many advantages as it can get and is as ready as possible for that content. Pretty much everything in Cataclysm said, players, if you want the best pre-raid gear you can get, go into Heroics. The tabard system got you Reputation, which unlocked raid level gear from Quartermasters. You got Valor points from Heroics, which could be used to purchase raid level gear with no hassle, and Chaos Orbs dropped in Heroics, which could sometimes be used to help craft epic level gear. This worked well because there were a lot of heroics with a lot of variety to them, and they were challenging enough to keep you occupied, and the difficulty of the heroics really helped to prepare you for the difficulty of raiding. So, how could you get the best possible pre-raid gear in Mists? Did they not fix what was not broken in Cataclysm? Sadly, no. They took the tabard system out altogether so you couldn't get reputation from heroics, and heroics weren't the best source of valor points either, and it's just as well. Instead of making the Valor vendor someone in your capital who you can just walk up to with no hassle and no need to unlock anything, you needed to get your reputations maxed out before you could spend Valor on raid level gear. And we just established that you can't get reputation from heroics. So how can you get reputation? Daily quests. Lots and lots and lots of daily quests. Week after week after week of grinding lots and lots and lots of daily quests. You know, I actually liked the dailies in Firelands because it was a different experience each time, and there were different decisions you could make about which kinds of dailies to work on, but there wasn't half as much variety in the daily grind for each of the launch factions in Pandaria, so it got old and boring really fast. Boring is the opposite of fun, and it's exactly what Blizzard was trying to avoid, ironically enough. I remember in my raiding days in Cataclysm that once I had my reputations maxed out and had accomplished everything outside of raids that I could, I basically stopped logging into WoW except when it was time for my guild to raid. If I hadn't been in a raiding guild at the time, I might well have stopped logging into WoW altogether. That is what Blizzard didn't want. So their response was to make the progression for raiders very, very long to try to stave off the moment when a player says, I have run out of things to do. Blizzard tried to sell this expansion as an expansion where there's a lot to do for max level players, and to be fair, there were quite a few bits and pieces to the game that reward players just for logging in and doing something. The farm in Halfhill and the Blingtron 4000 are examples of that, but whatever Blizzard had been trying to do, the end result was a grindy mess that wasn't fun and didn't even make sense. And remember those Chaos Orbs I told you about in Cataclysm? Blizzard ditched the Chaos Orb system and the elemental item system that had worked for the last 3 expansions, for that matter, and pretty much merged those two systems together into the Mode of Harmony system. Instead of a blue item for crafting that drops at the end of a heroic, Motes of Harmony are items that have a small chance to drop off of enemies you fight in the overworld. Then you can combine 10 of them into a blue crafting item. So if you want to get your hands on these crafting items, Blizzard's answer was, go out and kill a lot of things. Know a good way to find things to kill? Do dailies. It's like everything in Mists was saying go grind, grind, and grind some more. That was the way to get your hands on the best pre-raid gear you could get, and it doesn't even make sense. Does fighting these not-so-high health enemies really prepare a player for the difficulty of raids? I don't think so. This also devalued heroics to the point where you never go back into them once you have enough gear. And heroics and dungeons in general were the backbone of WoW in vanilla and throughout all 3 expansions leading up to Mists. Why make them irrelevant now? It's worth adding that heroics in Mists were once again easy. It's like there is a pendulum that swings back and forth each expansion. The heroics were difficult in the Burning Crusade, easy in Wrath, hard again in Cataclysm, easy again in Mists, and it looks like they'll be hard again in Warlords of Draenor. I think the reason that Blizzard made heroics so easy in Mists was that they got a lot of complaints that heroics were too difficult in Cataclysm from players who were used to easy heroics in Wrath. Then they got messages from players like me who liked the challenge of difficult heroics. Apparently, Blizzard translated those mixed messages into every player saying, give me something for me. So Blizzard tried to do just that. They made the heroics easy, but they also added something called challenge modes that were kind of like heroic heroics. They had added difficulty and were meant for guilds to tackle, since you couldn't queue for them like you could for heroics or looking for raid. And there were special gear rewards you could get from these challenge modes. Hey, wait a minute. You can get gear from this difficult PvE content? This would be a perfect addition to the progression, wouldn't it? I mean, if the gear you can get from challenge modes has the best stats on it that you can get before you set foot into raids, that would make it the perfect bridge for a progression guild going from heroics into raids. This would be just like the dungeon sets you could get in vanilla. Once again, this is something I should have mentioned in my vanilla video. I'm going to be saying I should have mentioned this sooner this whole series long, aren't I? In any case, in vanilla there were some armor sets that were kind of like tier sets that you could get in regular dungeons. There was Lightforge for paladins, there was Devout for priests, Valor for warriors, etc. This is a concept that went away probably around Wrath of the Lich King, but if they had brought it back for these challenge modes it would have been perfect. Except that challenge mode gear was only cosmetic and was intended for transmogrification. It had no stats on it. Blizzard, you passed up a golden opportunity for a progression that made sense. One thing to be said for Blizzard is that they at least made an attempt at changing things up when the next raid tier came out. There were still a lot of daily quests on the Isle of Thunder, but there were so many of them and so many different locations that the dailies were varied, and while I can't speak for every player, the variety at least kept me engaged enough to see it through to the final quest on the island. From what I understand, and I might be wrong about this, but Blizzard actually made looking for raid come before raiding for hardcore guilds during the Thunder King raid tier. I'm not sure whether this would work as a progression system or not, but when you stop and think about it, doesn't looking for raid show you all the content you'd see if you went into regular raiding? And what's the point of doing more difficult stuff if you've already seen what's in that difficult stuff, and the only reward you'd get for completing it is changing the color of your gear? Blizzard changed the progression again when they released the final raid, and with it the Timeless Isle. Timeless Isle was meant to be a throwback to the days of vanilla, when you got reputation by killing lots of things, and there was a lot of exploration. And quite understandably, there was hardly a daily quest to be found on the Timeless Isle. But instead of reputation or crafting professions getting you the best pre-raid gear, tokens for pre-raid gear dropped off of bosses or dropped randomly off of enemies. So instead of taking forever to gear yourself up for raids, it took almost no time. So for casuals like me, instead of there being tons and tons of things to do at level 90, there was little to do because you got your character maxed out so fast. Blizzard would probably say in response to that, so, go back and max out your reputations on some older factions. In fact, that's practically a requirement for some stuff on Timeless Isle. If you don't have some means of walking on water, such as the water bug mount you get from the anglers, you can't keep up with one of the waterborne bosses. You will be swimming after it, completely unable to keep up, screaming for a death knight to invite you to his group or a shaman to cast water walk on you, and they won't. Because they are running after that boss as fast as they can too, and they don't have time for you. And by the time you're anywhere near that boss, it's already dead, and you don't get any loot. Yuck. And that's not the only frustrating thing you miss out on if you don't grind things out in previous content and mists. If you didn't complete the legendary cloak quest lines with Wrathion, you can't fight Ordos. Even if you get to the mountain where Ordos lives, you get ported out if you don't have the cloak. It's so annoying. You know, earlier I said boring is the opposite of fun, but frustrating is also the opposite of fun. And that's what Blizzard managed with Timeless Isle. You know, my first impression about all these factions and the Wrathion quest chain was that, at least for a casual like me, they were supposed to be fun, optional things that you can choose to spend your time on or not to spend your time on. But by cutting off access to these bosses unless you completed these so-called optional bits of content, Blizzard essentially made that content required. Retroactively. Surprise! You know, there's a fine line between rewarding players who completed that kind of content and punishing players who didn't. And Blizzard crossed that line when they designed Timeless Isle. What were they thinking? Now, I've ripped on the progression in Mists a lot here, and Blizzard has made some fatal mistakes, but there is one silver lining to all of this. When things went wrong, Blizzard at least made a real attempt at fixing the problem. And these weren't small tweaks, they were big changes. They showed a real willingness to make big changes. Now granted, these attempts they made at fixing the problems generally didn't succeed, and Blizzard tended to overcompensate and fail to think through the consequences of their solutions. But at least they did something. They could have said, screw that, we'll just leave it broken and not do anything about it. Or they could have said, screw that, we're not going to make big changes to fix these big problems, we'll make teeny tiny little changes and hope that it's enough to satisfy them. Back in Vanilla and the Burning Crusade, the Blizzard I knew from back then probably would have left it broken or only made small changes. Instead, this Blizzard rolled up its sleeves and actually tried to do something. So, on the whole, Blizzard tried a lot of experiments with Mists of Pandaria. Some experiments, like the storytelling, were good additions to WoW that I want to see carried on into Warlords of Draenor, but many were failed experiments. I can relate. I was actually originally planning on having a music video for this part. I had the lyrics written out, and while I like to think that the lyrics and melody were decent enough, I lack either the tools or the skills or both to get a presentable music video backing that melody up. Let me show you a small sampling of this debacle. Cataclysm had a problem, new expansion, time to solve them. Once these reps are all gone through, they run out of things to do. Yuck. See, I'm learning from Blizzard's mistake. When something doesn't work, I don't do it. That's why I scrapped the music video idea and switched to straight up commentary on mists. Here's hoping that Blizzard will learn from their mistakes too. I'll talk about class design changes and maybe professions in the next part.